Thank you very much, Louise. Hello, thanks for coming. I'm glad to see you all. My name is Mark Levine, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about violence, particularly violence in public spaces, often alcohol-fueled violence in public spaces. So it's really nice that Sage has laid on some booze for you to really get into this spirit. I am a social psychologist by training, although I now work a lot with technologists, and I'm going to tell you about some of the collaborations that I've been involved in with interesting technology folk too. But the background to my research begins in a kind of critique of traditional social psychology. Some of the core ideas in social psychology, which actually have been given away to the public really, in terms of theories about how people behave when they're in groups and crowds. Traditional psychology tends to tell us that crowds or groups even are bad for us, that they make us do things that we would not normally do if we were on our own. So you get ideas of mob violence or mass hysteria or peer group pressure. So the idea of being embedded in a group somehow does something bad to us, it releases controls, all this bad stuff happens. And that's one very, very strong story in the popular mind as well as in academic circles. The flip side of that, the negative influence on groups, on individuals, is also one which says that groups make us passive. They also stop us from behaving well. In addition to making us do all these atavistically dangerous, terrible things, for example, there's a notion of the bystander effect, for example, where if you come across an emergency in the presence of others, you're not able to do the right thing. So both ways around, it seems, the story is groups are bad for us. They make us do these terrible things or they stop us doing the right thing. And that's the traditional story. Groups are bad for our psychological health in some way. And the theory behind this in psychology is often attributed to a notion of de-individuation. And what psychologists mean by that is this idea that when we're on our own, we're able to act in terms of the personal controls, our personal identity, our norms and values which guide us. And that's the thing which keeps us doing the right thing. As soon as we find ourselves in groups, that immersion in the group leads to a kind of anonymity. We go from having an identity to losing our identity. It's distributed or lost in the group. And it's that immersion in the group that allows all this primitive, nasty, dark, dangerous, violent stuff to spill out. And that's a very strong story, but it's also a story that over the last 15, 20 years has begun to be critiqued by a new approach in social psychology. And that approach is driven by people like Steve Reicher and Alex Haslam, who draw on theories like social identity theory or self-categorization theory to make this argument. When we're on our own, we have a personal identity. When we are in a group or with others, it's not that we lose our identity, but rather we then come to inhabit a social identity, the values of the group that we're with. So traditional story is you go from having an identity to losing an identity. The social identity story is you go from a personal identity, which has norms and values, to a social identity, which has norms and values. Now, sometimes those group identity values might favor violence, but often they don't. So it's trying to understand what the values of the group are, rather than assuming that as soon as we're in a group, we no longer have any kind of control, that it's this dark, primitive stuff which spills out of us and you can't really explain it, rather than actually trying to look at what people do and don't do when they engage in violence. And why that's interesting is, it's something, for example, that historians have been doing for a very long time. Social psychologists are very late to the game in this. So eminent historians like Natalie Davis, she produced a beautiful manuscript about religious conflict in 16th century France. So she looks at the record of this intercommunal violence between Catholics and Protestants in this small village. And of course, the conflict between them is over who the heretic is. For the Catholics, heresy is embodied in the Protestants themselves, because Protestants want a direct relationship to God. They don't want it mediated through the church. And heresy lies within them. For the Protestants, the heresy lies in the pomp and circumstances and trapping of the church. So they see that as the heretical thing. It's come between us and our gods. And what Davis points out is that when the Catholics attack the Protestants, it's violent, it's gory, they eviscerate, they kill people and they cut them open, they literally disembowel them. It's almost as though they are looking for the source of the heresy inside the bodies of the Protestants. When the Protestants kill the Catholics, or the Catholic priests, they're not interested in the bodies at all, because heresy isn't there for them. Heresy is in the pomp and circumstance of the church. So they kill the Catholics, but then they defecate in the font, and they use the holy oil to clean their boots. Because for them, the violence is patterned by their understanding of what this means in terms of intercommunal relations and the notion of how you ought to be living. There's an identity component associated with the group that's important. So you can see, if you look in violence itself, the collective understandings that people have, rather than, as traditional social psychology does, treats it as this kind of primitive outpouring which you can't really explain because it's all about losing control. And this idea of identities, groups and identities, can also be used to look at how violence can be stopped by people in group settings. So a colleague of mine, Clifford Stott, has done some really interesting work looking at football crowds. And Clifford did this. We shared an office together, and Clifford managed the wizard trick of persuading the ESRC to fund his PhD, which meant he could go to the World Cup and hang around with football fans and do his research. And what he was interested in at that stage, I mean, things have changed a lot. English football fans had this very violent reputation for going abroad. They were seen as a source of threat and danger everywhere they went. And he went to the World Cup in France, and he hung around with English and Scottish football fans, talking to them, collecting some data, trying to find out how they understood the nature of what they were doing. And he tells this rather interesting story. He was in a camp waiting between games, and in the campsite there were lots of Scottish fans and also lots of Tunisian fans, because they were in the same group. And he was just a nice sunny day, and he was watching a pickup football game between some Scots and some Tunisians. And the game was going along fine, and then one of the Scottish lads starts to get a bit angry, starts to get a bit aggressive with one of the Tunisians, starts to push and shove him, and then knocks him over, and a fight is about to happen. And then Clifford says, out of the trees around the campsite come hordes of Scots. They descend onto the pitch, and you think, oh, this is going to be some kind of terrible, terrible bloodbath. What the Scottish fans do is they pick up the Tunisian and pat him down. They pick up the Scottish lad who started this fight, and they give him an almighty pasting. And Clifford goes to them afterwards and says, what was going on? And the Scottish fan story is this. They say, we Scots, we're like the Brazil of football fans. Everybody loves us. We wear kilts, we drink. We're just great when we're abroad. We're friendly. It's the English who are the violent, dangerous xenophobes. And what that guy was doing was making us look like the English. And I don't know how many Scots are here, but there's nothing worse for a Scot. You can testify, can't you? To be accused of being English is about the most heinous thing that could possibly happen to you. So this is an interesting example, because I imagine, I have no evidence for this, but I imagine that outside a football stadium in Glasgow, let's say, if you saw a similar kind of thing, maybe those fans wouldn't necessarily go over and intervene in the way they did in this particular context at this particular time. Because for them, what they were doing was trying to preserve an idea of their identity, their reputation in the eyes of others. So sometimes you can harness the power of the group and the values in the group to get people in those groups to police the bad behavior of folks within them who might be bringing the group into disrepute or shaming them and so on. So I've always been quite interested in the potential power of the group and group processes to tackle antisocial behavior. But because psychology always sees the group as the source of danger, there's very little research which actually looks at the power of the group for good. So a lot of the work I've been doing has been trying to tackle that. Most of the evidence which tells us that groups do this kind of negative thing to us actually comes using techniques which never actually engage with violence itself. So you get lots of survey-based stuff. You get some observational stuff, it's true, but not very much. You get interview-type stuff where people explain why they did or didn't do some stuff, but psychologists already know that what people say and what they do is not necessarily the same thing. You have some lab studies. In the lab studies, violence tends to be done by proxy. So I don't know if any of you have come across the hot sauce paradigm. Essentially, violence here is where people are asked in the context of an experiment to give other people wickedly hot pepper drinks to drink. Okay, so I don't think that's necessarily the same. It's a proxy, but it's not really like engaging in violence. Another one of these is sticking pins in voodoo dolls. That's Nigel Farage, if you want to stick a pin in him. But again, I think these are interesting approximations, but they don't really capture the full nature of what it's like to be immersed in an incident like this and to actually see it unfold in real time. And so I began to be interested in whether I could actually study violence in real life. And I started being interested in this because I was doing some work with some police forces in the north of England, looking at behaviour around violence in the nighttime economy. And I guess we're all familiar with nighttime economy zones. I mean, they were this Faustian pact between city councils and the government to regenerate inner city areas through alcohol, which led to kind of lots of anxiety over people drinking, lots of young people particularly drinking in groups at night, and thousands of them kind of wandering around because, of course, it's a circuit drinking culture for us. And so you get this toxic brew of alcohol, groups, violence, de-individuation type conditions. You should expect there to be lots and lots and lots of violence. And there's certainly stories about this being one of the big social problems of our time. But I think this is rather interesting. So I did this work in cities like Leeds and Manchester, so big northern cities with big nighttime economy zones. Depending on the time of year and the state of the economy, on a Friday or a Saturday night, there could be anywhere between 75 and 150,000 people out drinking and taking drugs, and often drinking and taking drugs together. And because it's a circuit drinking culture, they will be moving from pub to club, so they don't just stay in one place. And in those cities, there will be probably at a maximum about 40 police officers in the city. Okay, now there is CCTV, but Home Office's own research shows that CCTV is not effective against this type of crime. It's good against car park crime, some kind of property crime, but it's not likely to stop you getting your head kicked in the city centre. There are bouncers, but the bouncers deal with their clubs, maybe 1,000 to 2,000, and they are not responsible for, nor can they deal with anything which happens in the street. So what you have is this combination of hundreds, sometimes, of thousands of people moving through the city centre under these conditions of intoxication and disinhibition, and 40 police officers apparently being there to keep control of them. So I think actually what's interesting about our cities is how little violence there is, not how much. Now, that's not to say that people don't tip up at accident and emergency. They clearly do. But if people can't keep control of themselves, and we're relying on the idea that the forces of authority must be in place to do it, the numbers just don't add up. I think there's something else going on, which is helping to keep control. And that's what I was interested in trying to untangle. And I tried to do it using this, CCTV control rooms. So they cover nearly every single town and city centre in the UK. They're under a bit of pressure now, under austerity, but they are still there. For those of you who don't know, I don't know whether you know this kind of stuff already, but it's estimated there are about 3.2 million cameras in the UK. We're one of the most surveyed countries outside North Korea. About one for every 22 people. And as I said, in terms of this kind of activity, I mean, it's quite good for some post hoc detection of events, but not for preemptive, preventative stuff. But in a way, I'm not interested in its effectiveness. I'm sort of interested in its utility for research purposes in this instance, because I was able to do some work with camera operators in one of these centres to talk to them about helping me to collect data which I could use to see whether when a spark for violence happens, how it goes from the spark to violence, and when it goes from the spark to being extinguished in some way. The problem with doing this kind of data collection is there are some privacy and data protection constraints which make the data interesting but limited in all sorts of ways. So clearly the advantage of doing it, this kind of CCTV analysis, is you get to see the violence in the raw. But as a social psychologist, it stripped away all the things I normally use to try and tell stories about how people are behaving. So I don't know anything about the individuals because I'm not allowed to. I don't know anything about the event. I don't know anything about the relationships between people. I've got no history. I don't know whether this event was the first time these folks had met or this was an ongoing thing. Most importantly, I've got no sound. So I don't know when someone's going like this, whether they're going, I'm going to knock your effing block off, or whether they're saying, oh, you've still got some of that kebab stuck in your teeth. I'm having to go backwards only from the behaviours, which is quite an interesting challenge. I mean, I can borrow techniques from primatologists and ethologists, but they often have an advantage over me because they know something about the hierarchical structure of the groups. I don't even know that. So what I'm going to try and persuade you is that just by being able to code up particular bits of behaviour without knowing anything else, you can tell some quite interesting stories about how groups impact on the trajectory of violence. I'm going to show you now, I hope, some of the footage. So it's slightly blurred and pixelated. I have to do that, and it's one of the conditions of me being able to have this data. There is some violence in this for those of you who might be a bit worried about it, and it comes right towards the end. But I'll click through and let it run, and I'll talk over it as I'm going along. Because what we do is we go through and code frame by frame the protagonist and the target, so who the main antagonists are, and then all the other third parties, all the other bystanders. And what we're interested in is whether they do something which is an escalating thing, so that's push, prod, punch, kick, that kind of stuff, or a de-escalating thing, so that's these kinds of hand gestures, calm down, rubbing of the back, separating kind of stuff. We're interested in their gender too. Let's hope I can do this without... Hurrah! Okay. So as you'll see as we go along, the antagonists are these two guys. So we're interested in coding up when they do something escalatory or de-escalatory towards each other. But we're also coding and counting all the third parties. And here you already see someone is coming to join. The thing you immediately notice is how much intervention there is, how often people come in and try and do something to intervene in some way. These two guys are now quite in each other's faces. Keep an eye on the pint. Something rather interesting happens to the pint. Here comes a woman to join, so we're interested in the gender of the third parties too. He's standing between him, so he's touched both of them and touches his face. See, he takes his beer. That's either to preserve it or stop him using it as a weapon. These two still... You can also notice that there are things going on amongst the third parties in the background, which we're also coding. So we're also interested in whether bystanders do escalatory or de-escalatory things to each other. I always have the feeling that you could almost score this like a choreography. People kind of come in and go out. There's a sort of movement and a flow to it. That's really quite typical. There's lots and lots of almost handing things over. Now, a punch, as I said, is thrown in this. It's not thrown in all of them. So you need to pick your puncher now, and I'll see at the end whether you're right to see who throws the first punch. You can see there's lots of kind of consolation things also happening amongst the third parties. They try to console each other as well as these things develop. You get some very interesting kind of spectator things, as you'll see. This guy's quite interesting. He never moves a muscle. You get quite a lot of that. For him, this is just entertainment. He's just standing there as it happens around him. But they are literally trying to push him out. and he's just not taking that message. They've pushed him and pushed him and pushed him. The guy's still giving him a bit of lip. Let's come back together again for a bit. Now, one of the things you might notice here is that the third parties have kind of disappeared. This is one of the things we've noticed is presages the onset of violence. It's slimmed right back. Bang, there you go. Did you pick him as your puncher? It's another interesting feature. And now, so one thing I haven't got to the bottom of it, the shirts come off. Very, very common. Another interesting thing we've discovered is humans are really bad at violence. They swing and they don't really like it very much. They can't really do it very well. But then sometimes it ends rather badly. Okay, so this is the kind of data that we've managed to get. Okay, so let me tell you a bit about how we work with this data. So in the actual study, we ended up with 42 clips we could use, but that was out of an original corpus of about 220. And we couldn't use them all because we had inclusion criteria for this. We had to be able to be sure that we'd seen the beginning to the end. And often, irritatingly for us, people would start some kind of Barney, and then they would go around the corner, and then they'd come back again, and we couldn't see them for a bit, so we couldn't use them. Or tree would get in the way as the camera was panning across. So we had to be able to see everything all the way through. It had to be a minimum of at least 20 acts. And then, as I said, we're interested in coding up at quite a coarse-grained level an escalating gesture and a de-escalating gesture. And then we're interested in the group size, so how many bystanders, how big is the group, what's the gender composition, and then some outcome measure of the severity of this kind of stuff. So sometimes people kind of looked as if they were throwing a punch but never really connected, and we got people to rate this for us. So again, I should say, we produce a code book for this. I don't do the rating. We produce a code book which says what we think counts as escalatory or de-escalatory. We train independent raters up, and they then come in and work through these things. And then we look to see, we have at least 2 of them, how well their rating agrees, to keep the judgments of this kind of stuff as objective as possible. And it turns out, although it's quite hard to write code books, humans are really, really good at judging whether these things are escalatory or de-escalatory and who's doing what to whom. Okay, so let me just remind you from the beginning what the predictions might be for this kind of data from a traditional social psychology point of view. So remember I said, traditional social psychology sees the group as bad for us. So one of the things you might predict based on that is that the bigger the group, the larger the group, the more antisocial stuff is going on. Okay, is that the case in our data? The second one is the flip side of that, which is the kind of bystander apathy, diffusion of responsibility thing, which is as the groups get bigger, there should be less pro-social stuff being contributed. People are less willing to get involved. Is that true? Well, it turns out that when you actually look at what's happening in these instances, group size doesn't bring more antisocial stuff. So as groups get bigger, this is kind of controlled for the size. You don't get proportionally more antisocial activity. What you do get is much, much more pro-social, calming down stuff as the groups get bigger. And if you do some kind of difference score between the two, as groups get bigger, the tendency for the impact of the behaviors of groups on the action is to de-escalate. It's to try and bring this kind of stuff under control. So bigger groups are doing more de-escalation. But as you've just seen in the clip I've shown you, it's not always successful. That was quite a large group. There was quite a lot of attempts to intervene, but it still went wrong. So it's not just the group size that's important. Maybe it's also what the actions are or who's doing them and when. So again, we went back to our data to try and unpick it a bit. Remember, what we've got in our data is who does what to whom and when. Okay, so that means that what we can do is look at our data and say, okay, let's identify every time a perpetrator does something aggressive. And that's what this is. That's the starting point. So we're interested in a perpetrator does something aggressive. Then, because we've coded up our data to say the next act is either escalatory or de-escalatory, it's a 50-50 probability that the next response to a perpetrator doing something aggressive will either be escalatory or de-escalatory. These are conditional probabilities. That's what that is. And so we can look at the first act which follows from a perpetrator doing something aggressive. It's either going to be an escalation or a de-escalation. This is by third parties. This is by bystanders. And it turns out that if you take all the clips we have which end in violence and you compare them with all the ones which end in peace, knowing the first response to a perpetrator's aggressive act doesn't help you to be able to predict whether this is going to end well or badly. So it's not the first thing that people do that's important. Same thing with the second act. If you know 2 acts, it turns out, at least in our data, that still isn't helping you to be able to work out whether this is going to end badly or well. Once you know 3 acts following the perpetrator doing something aggressive, then you can begin to be able to tell with a reasonable degree of probability whether this is going to end peacefully or violently. So that's quite interesting. You need to know 3 acts. We still don't really know why that's important. So we tried to do a bit more digging. And we started looking in other literatures. So there is some third-party policing literature, which is kind of the bystander getting involved stuff, in animal behaviour. And in the animal behaviour literature, third-party policing is successful, it works, when you have what animal behaviour specialists call asymmetric societies. So that's ones where you've got like an alpha male at the top. And the animal with the most power comes in and intervenes, and then everyone agrees that animal has the power to do this kind of stuff, and that stops the problem. There are, of course, more democratic animal societies where there are a number of contending individuals for power, and third-party intervention in there tends to make things worse because no one can really agree that these individuals have got the right to intervene. So is it, for example, in our data that you need to have someone who is recognizably the leader of the group going, stop, stop, stop 3 times, and that's going to make people calm down? Or is it some kind of combination of one person goes stop, another person goes stop, and then someone else goes, the first person goes stop, yes again? Or the last possibility is it's 3 separate individuals. Remember, you need to know 3 acts. It could be first person, second person, third person intervening. So we went back to check that in our data. So this one here is the same person always doing the intervention. So that's like potentially the alpha male stop, stop, stop. Remember, there are lots of other people around at the same time. These are all combinations of 1s and 2s, where at least 2 individuals do some stuff. And even if you add those together, that's not significant. But if you look at the one person on their own doing it in the context of lots of other people being around, that tends to make things worse in our data, much more likely to end in violence. The one which is most likely to end in peace is this one at the end, where you have 3 separate individuals doing the acts. So it's a bit like 2 folks are fighting. I come along and go, stop, stop, stop. Louise comes along and says, yeah, 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 stop. And then a third person comes along and says, okay, we need to stop. So there's the idea of perhaps consensus amongst the group. If 3 individuals in the group are doing this, that this is actually no longer tolerated by the group. Whereas if it's only one person doing it and everyone else is kind of watching, then perhaps the antagonists read this as license to continue. There's not consensus here, we should stop. Okay, so that's one of our potential hypotheses about this. Okay, so just to sum up, at least this bit. If one person does it in the context of lots of other folk, actually that's not good. It's not just about empowering an individual to take responsibility. There needs to be something more than that. If it's by 3 separate actors coordinating together, we're not quite sure how they do that, but if they do that, that's most likely to lead to a successful, peaceful outcome. And it doesn't seem that this is the same kind of third-party policing as you find in the animal literature, where it's about a powerful individual doing this kind of stuff. I asked you to pick who threw the first punch. How many of you went for someone who wasn't one of the antagonists? Somebody said, yeah, I picked them, yeah, okay. So when we started doing the research, we thought you could tell who a perpetrator is because they're the ones that do the punching. But it turns out that that's not the case. So the person that everyone agrees is the protagonist or the perpetrator tends to throw the punch in our data only about half the time. This is the first punch. Very occasionally, a victim, the person who's kind of on the receiving end, will throw the first punch, and we think that's kind of just going, I'm going to get my retaliation in first before they hit me. On a third of occasions, over a third of occasions, the first punch, as in the video I've just shown you, was actually thrown by someone who is a third party or a bystander. And when we first saw that, we thought, okay, well, the classic way to interpret this is a kind of ganging up on the weak. You know that this guy's about to get a kicking, you're quite excited about the prospect of this, and you can get your sneaky punch in first before someone else does, because it's going to be possible. But that's not what happens. When third parties throw punches, they tend to throw them towards the person everyone agrees is the protagonist, the perpetrator. Okay, so, and I'll show you why I think that happens in the next clip, which is a classic example of this, with a bit of luck. Okay, so here's another one of our clips. Stripy shirted man and man in the white shirt. You can tell stripy shirted man is very keen to get to the man in the white shirt. And again, most of the action happens between the two third parties and the stripy shirted man. The guy in the white shirt is always very careful to make sure he always has someone between him and the guy who wants to knock his block off. But notice how they kind of, again, it's sort of a choreography. They kind of tag team. One person takes him, the other person takes the other guy, then they swap around. They're careful to kind of manage this. They're telling him, come on, this is enough, let's leave this. Sometimes they double team him. You watch, he kind of pushes him away. He holds him. Keep an eye on the victim in this, because something very interesting happens at the end. Again, there is a punch thrown in this, but you can see they are sort of pushing him away. He's really not taking no for an answer. Trying to get right up in his face. They've talked to him a number of times about this now. He's really thinking of selling him away as well. They're going to try and walk away, but no, he still wants to do this. Bang. Ooh. Ow. So, what you have here is essentially the group trying to police behaviours. Did you see the little kick at the end? The guy gives it. Well, okay, so those of you who want to see it at the end, the guy in the white shirt does absolutely nothing all the way through, but as soon as the guy's on the ground, he gives him a sneaky kick in the head. So nasty. But I mean, I guess the main moral of this particular story is this guy is being told by these others to stop doing this. They're saying stop, 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 and in the end they go, oh, for fuck's sake, and whack him. So it's kind of violence in the service of non-violence. They're using perhaps an inappropriate method, but what they're trying to do is enforce this notion that actually violence is not appropriate here and it's not sanctioned by the group. Okay, so what am I trying to persuade you so far? That the traditional story in social psychology that groups lead to antisocial behavior is partial at best. Okay? That in our data, there's lots of evidence that actually groups are de-escalating and not escalating. So we need to think carefully about how we think about the power of the group and not always assume that the power of groups is by default negative. In fact, this tendency to intervene pro-socially increases as group sizes get bigger. So I'll probably say a bit more at the end, but when we work with police officers, we try to talk to them about this idea that they don't necessarily need to break every group up because they think groups of lads on the street are potentially threatening. Because often they should be able to harness the pro-social tendencies of those groups to manage the behavior of individuals inside them. There's also this idea that violence can serve conserve a norm of non-violence. So it's maybe a tendency to see all violence as antisocial, that in this instance you get to see some sense that violence is slightly more nuanced and meaningful. And finally, successful de-escalation of these sorts of situations, I think, it's a cumulative accomplishment. It needs to be done by collective coordination of the people who are there. And we don't know very much about how that works. And if we want to be able to intervene, to strengthen that, facilitate it, we need to know more about how this works. But it's quite hard to do that, even with the kind of data that I've got. I'm going to do a brief segue, because I know one of the interesting things you might be interested in is the kind of ethics of this kind of research. So we often need to think carefully about what the ethical implications of using this kind of data are, and I have to justify, when I write my ethics clearances for this kind of stuff, how I get to use the data and what happens to it. So I already can show it to you as long as it's pixelated. It's normally much clearer. But there are some issues about informed consent. The people I've just shown you don't know that I have this footage and I'm doing this research with it. I can't get informed consent from them. I'm able to persuade ethics bodies that I can do this because the places that I have the footage from already have signs up saying that this is a space in which these kinds of behaviours are recorded. And so there's an assumption that if people go into these spaces, that they are tacitly giving their consent to be recorded in this way. There's also a story to tell about whether there's a value in public good out of the story that can be told based on this kind of data. So I can use it for training. I can use it also for potentially devising new ways to improve public safety. But increasingly you have to be careful now about the dangers of de-anonymization. So this kind of stuff could appear on the web, and now there are lots of very sophisticated technologies which allow you to take screenshots and then to run them so that you can then link them with other photos. So it's possible that people who are in my footage could have their identities revealed by people who might want to do this kind of stuff. That's quite difficult to manage. So again, I have lots of anxieties about the management of this kind of data. But in the context of digital data and ethics, it's an interesting thing to consider. Okay, let's go back. So I've tried to persuade you can tell some interesting stories with the data, but clearly it's limited. It's limited for the reasons I outlined at the beginning in terms of not knowing very much about these people, so it's hard to tell. I have some colleagues in Denmark who've been able to work with the police to put together this kind of footage with police files in serious cases where the footage has been used as part of the police case. So they then can see some of the information about who the people are and their history and that kind of stuff. But that, of course, those are kind of cases which are incredibly serious, and they may not necessarily have the same kind of qualities as the more run-of-the-mill kind of scuffles in a town centre. But that's one of the ways in which you might be able to get around that kind of stuff. But essentially, in this kind of data, I'm describing to you patterns of associations without really able to test some of the assumptions that I'm making. So I'm interested in whether it's possible to keep the kind of veridical quality of embedding people in what feels like real life, but being able to manipulate that to be able to explore some of the parameters I think are important for explaining how people are behaving. So that led me to some collaborations with some folks who are interested in virtual reality. I don't have a virtual reality setup, so I rely on collaborators who, for over 25 years, have been showing that embedding people in a virtual reality environment can lead to extremely veridical responses to stimuli, which allow you to be able to say that you might be getting as close as you possibly could to real life without bumping into, or at least being able to persuade ethics bodies that you can circumvent some of the concerns that they have about exposing people to real life violence. We work in a cave setup. So a cave is a meters wide kind of projection space, and using a head-mounted display, you can put a head-mounted display on people and they can walk into an environment which has side projections and they can orientate around it. I'm going to show you a clip of one in a minute, but you can also then interact with life-size avatars. So it's a fully immersive environment where you get to interact with avatars. The way it works, again, this is not really my area of expertise, but there are some quite interesting features, I think, of this, is it uses head tracking and the stereo field of view. So that's what the head-mounted displays for, and these head-mounted displays are getting more and more sophisticated all the time. And it relies on, in order to be able to expose people to an environment in which they feel they're having this kind of experience on several visual perception and sensory motor contingencies. Essentially, your perceptual system allows, through a couple of illusions, you to feel like you are in the situation, that there's a kind of presence. So there's a place illusion, a strong kind of sense of you being there, and there's also a plausibility illusion, that you kind of think these things are real, even though you know they really aren't. So I don't know if any of you have done this kind of stuff, but I often, when I go into these environments, you're met by an avatar, the avatar smiles at you, and you can't help yourself, you smile back. You know this person is not alive, but so it relies on those sorts of responses. It's also interesting, it doesn't have to be too real. So there's this notion of the Uncanny Valley, where if the avatars are too human-like, you start paying too much attention to the fact that they are too human-like and get a bit weirded out. So actually some of the kind of blurriness, lips don't have to be perfectly synced, eyes don't have to blink completely, but you're prepared to inhabit the illusion. I mean, we've all done the blue dress, gold dress, what do you hear kind of things. Your perceptual system's constantly filling in bits of information for you. So what we've done is try to create a violent incident, or a space for a violent incident to happen in virtual reality, so that we can manage this. We can manage we can use it to manipulate certain things experimentally. We don't have to deceive people. We just don't tell them anything when they come to the lab. They go in, we don't tell them what to expect. We might prime them with certain things before. It's also great because the virtual avatars do the same thing over and over again. I have done this stuff with performers before, and they tend to extemporize a little bit, and after a while they get bored and start going off script and kind of making it more interesting for themselves. So at least we know experimentally that people are being exposed to the same thing over and over again. Okay, so when we first tried to do this, we couldn't persuade research bodies to give us any money to do it. They didn't really believe it. Psychologists thought, this is just too far away from anything sensible. Computer scientists thought, this is just psychology, it's not really worth funding. So my collaborator, Mel Slater, who's now in Barcelona, did something really interesting. He went away and did a virtual reprise of the Milgram studies. How many of you know the Milgram studies? Do I need to say very much about it? These are the ones where people give electric shocks, or believe they give electric shocks to other people. And what he did was he ran the baseline condition of Milgram study. And the baseline condition of Milgram study is where the teacher gives an experimental shock to a learner who's in another room that they can't see, with someone telling them, an experimenter in the same room as them. And Milgram found that in that experiment that 65% of the participants in his original study were prepared to go on and give a lethal dose, XXX, of electricity to a learner in a psychology experiment. Okay, so it's been a classic, extremely influential study. And Mel went and redid the Milgram paradigm, got ethics permission to do it, with an avatar as the learner, as the person receiving the shocks. So people came in and did the study with them. When they made the mistakes, they gave them shocks. And interestingly enough, the results in the baseline condition were about the same. So even though people knew that the avatar wasn't really real, the pattern of responses in terms of how far people were prepared to go looked pretty much like Milgram's original study, which then persuaded some of the research bodies that actually there might be something in this as a medium for exploring behavior in extremes around violence, where ethically it's quite difficult to do this kind of stuff. So what we did was set up an experiment where we looked at violence in a virtual bar. So we created a virtual bar, and we used a cave to do it. So that's one of these multi-side projection spaces, and people came and put the goggles on. And what we did was we recruited only Arsenal football fans. It was partly pragmatic. It was done at UCL, and so it was an area of London where we reckoned there might be enough Arsenal fans to take part. And so we knew this in advance. They came to the cave, they put on the goggles, and we just asked them to go into the bar and just then interact with the folks they found in the bar. When they went in, they encountered an avatar who came over to them and started having a bit of a chat, and the avatar presented themselves as either a fellow Arsenal fan or just an ordinary fan, football fan, didn't give any team affiliation. And you have a bit of a conversation, and the conversation is Wizard of Oz. So there's someone behind a screen with a series of conversational gambits speaking for the avatar. So the avatar will say things like, I see you're an Arsenal fan. And how do you think we're doing this year? And no, we can't do this now, but what do you think of the manager? And that sort of stuff. As long as the avatar is leading, you can have quite a good conversation. And then, at an appropriate junction, another avatar gets up in the bar and comes over and starts picking on the avatar you've just spoken to. Starts prodding and poking and antagonizing him. And then we're interested in, what do you do? So I'm going to show you what that looks like. There's some bad language in this. So again, for those of you of a nervous disposition, you can put your fingers in your ears now. Okay, so hopefully that will play, and hopefully we'll be able to hear the sound. Oh, no sound. Oh, yeah.
Don't you think we could find a better goalkeeper?
So this is the guy you meet. You're having a bit of a chat. You've been doing this for a while.
Wait. You got a problem? Sorry? I said, have you got a problem? No, mate. I saw you looking at me. I didn't look at you. Well, I saw you. I saw you staring. No, I wasn't staring at you. So to get off your chest? No. You sure about that? There's nothing wrong, mate. There's no trouble here. I'm just trying to enjoy a quiet pint. Yeah, well, that's what I was doing. Enjoy a quiet pint. Go back to your table and enjoy a quiet pint. Fuck, you told me to go back to my table. I'm not telling you what to do, man. I think you was. Just leave it out. Leave it out? There's no need for any hassle, okay? I'm not causing any hassle. I'm coming here for a quiet drink and you are staring at me. I wasn't staring at you. I wasn't even looking in that direction. So you're saying I'm wrong? I'm just saying there's no trouble here. What's that? What the fuck is that? What? Was it a fucking Arsenal shirt? Yes. You actually go to house with a fucking Arsenal shirt? Yes. Fucking take it off. What? I hate Arsenal. Take it off. I'm sorry to hear that. Take the fucking shirt off. It offends me. It offends me. I'm not taking my shirt off. You actually walk out of the house with a fucking Arsenal shirt. It's ridiculous. It's sick. You actually support Arsenal. Yes, I'm an Arsenal fan. What's the last thing they won? That's the fucking last thing they won. Doesn't matter. Nothing. No fucking cups. Shit. Just leave it out. Just leave it alone. I don't want any hassle. You'll leave it tonight, but you come in here with your Arsenal top, giving me grief, staring at me. I didn't realise it was illegal. Just let me sit down and have my pint. You fucking tell me what to do. I'm not your mate. I don't know you. I'm sorry. Bloody Arsenal shirt. Sorry. Don't be so sorry because you support a shit team. I'm sorry. What more can I do? I'm sorry. I'll finish my pint and then I'll go. Okay? Why don't you fuck off now? Why don't you leave now? Well, take your pint and fuck off. Why? Because you offend me. That shirt offends me. I told you. Take it off and you can stay in. I'm not going to take it off and have a drink. I'm not going to take the fucking shirt off! Leave it though. What's going on here? You fucking told me to leave it out. You fucking tell me to leave it out!
So you imagine you're standing quite close to that when it's happening. I mean, I've seen it lots now, and I can still feel the tension in it. I mean, it's still there. And you've interacted with this avatar before. So we're interested in, what do people do? Do they just sort of treat it like the telly and just think, oh, this is interesting? Or do they do some kind of intervention? And so the interesting thing is that levels of intervention in this are actually really quite high, around about 70%. And by intervention, we mean people saying things. They'll say things like, come on, this is unnecessary. Oh, leave them, stop doing this kind of stuff. And they'll do what I've just done, which is they'll reach out and they'll try and do a bit of mediating. And the interesting thing is that that's also patterned by the group membership of the victim. So they're much more likely to do that when the avatar they've just been chatting to is presented as an Arsenal fan rather than just an ordinary football fan they've come across. So even though people know this is not real, they still are prepared to be involved in it. And interestingly enough, that involvement is patterned by the importance of psychological group membership in a stranger. You've just met this person, but if they're a bit more like you, then you're more likely to feel responsible and to continue to do the intervention. Now, there are sort of waves in the presentation of that. So the first kind of prompt is a kind of personal attack. You're looking at me, that kind of stuff. And then the victim does a kind of thing which says, go back and sit down. So we're interested in, and the guy says, don't fucking tell me what to do, but we're interested in whether these different things are more or less likely to elicit responses from folk. And then the attack changes to a group level attack. So he says, it's that fucking Arsenal shirt. So he goes from the personal to the group. So we're trying to look at whether these different psychological qualities of groupiness and appeal to help, whether it's a personal or a group level attack, shape the nature of intervention. Okay, so the next thing we've done is to look more closely at the bystander effect. So this is where what we're interested in is not necessarily only about the membership of the victim in this, but whether, if there are other people in the bar, whether their group membership might affect the way you act. So we can populate the bar. You can see in here, so sometimes the other people sitting having quiet pints are also wearing Arsenal shirts, or they're not. And then the argument you've just seen begins to happen, and somebody comes over, a bystander comes over and sort of stands nearby. Either they're wearing the Arsenal shirt or they're not. And in our study, they say things like, come on, let's stop this, or go on, give him a bit of trouble. So they do a bit of either escalation or de-escalation. So we're interested in, does this kind of stuff have an effect on the naive participants' responses, and does that make a difference? Okay. Now, what this is looking at the effect of the bystanders, both in terms of whether they encourage or discourage, and whether they are in-group or out-group. Okay. And we discovered that actually the encouragement versus discouragement thing didn't really seem to work, didn't really seem to have any kind of effect. And we think maybe that's because people didn't really engage with or see what this bystander avatar was doing, maybe. But what's most interesting about what we found in the study was it worked completely the opposite direction to how we had anticipated. I had imagined that the presence of other Arsenal fans in the bar would empower the naive participant to intervene. They think, these guys are all Arsenal, I'm just going to get in there and I'm going to tell this guy to fuck off. But in fact, that's not what happens. At least in our data, people are much more likely to intervene, Arsenal fans to help a fellow Arsenal fan in distress, when the other people in the bar are just neutral. They're just out-group kind of folk, which is quite interesting because it starts to speak to what are the qualities of third-party intervention we need to encourage. Do we need to encourage empowerment? The feeling that these other people will do stuff with you? Is it the fact that you need to feel more responsible for a fellow group member? That's a different kind of strategy. So we can begin to play these kinds of things out using this paradigm to test different sorts of approaches. Okay, so again, thinking about the advantages, disadvantages of using this kind of virtual reality environment. One of the advantages is it's not real, which therefore makes it ethically possible. We can persuade the ethics folk in talking to people afterwards. They often really enjoy the experience and they say it was great to be involved in it. And there's not a concern, I think, that people feel that in some way they've been challenged or tricked to feel that they might have crossed some kind of moral line in a way which would upset them ethically in the future. Their behaviour is kind of veridical in the sense that it's kind of how they would behave, but near enough for everyone to feel relaxed that no long-term damage can be done to them. It also gives us kind of experimental control, I think, which is an important feature. The disadvantage, of course, is that it's not real. So we're not really sure how big this veridical gap actually is. It's certainly much richer than traditional methods of doing this kind of stuff, which are pen and paper, interview-based, observational kind of stuff. It's quite expensive, but it's starting to get cheaper. I think one of the key things is it requires a new kind of expertise, and it requires interdisciplinary collaboration to be able to do this kind of stuff. I think it's it's extremely difficult for anybody in psychology to have the wherewithal and the skills breadth to be able to pull together all the different kinds of elements. So it speaks really to the move towards interdisciplinary science. Okay, so I think the big pitch for VR in all of this is, at least in the work that I'm interested in, it offers the opportunity to go to the extremes, to be able to examine behaviour, extreme kind of behaviour where it wouldn't really be possible to do it in any other ways. I don't think it overcomes the fundamental problem of experimental studies, but it's certainly already telling us some things we didn't think we knew about how third parties and bystanders respond to violence. It's giving us new opportunities to think things through in a different way. So, to finish, I hope I've given you a sense, thinking about the CCTV data, virtual reality data, that you can see engaging with this kind of data is producing new insights in a field where for a long time we thought we understood how bystanders behave, but at the same time there was widespread acceptance that we've never really been able to use those insights to really produce effective intervention strategies. I think actually part of the problem was we didn't really understand what it's really like in violence, as opposed to thinking about how these things might play out in more mundane situations. And I think that's one of the gaps there is between expertise and practice. And I think that one of the potentials for the future is to be able to harness the power of third parties in these kinds of situations, to be able to increase the likelihood of promoting pro-sociality, of tackling antisocial behaviour, not treating third parties and bystanders as a potential problem to be overcome in a public policing setting, but to be able to harness, I think, the naturally existing tendency of others to want to help to mediate and intervene, but to understand how to do that in a way which is productive rather than dangerous. And I think the next step is to take these kinds of ideas to make sure we've got a solid science base for making recommendations about how the police and the public ought to be behaving when they are exposed to violence in public places. Okay, I'll stop. Oh, I also really need, talking about interdisciplinary work, to thank an enormous team of really fantastic collaborators who worked on this with me. So.
Thank you. Mark, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I hope you all enjoyed that as much as I did. But yes, so we're going to do question and answer session. For anybody watching online, I'm going to repeat your question afterwards so that's picked up on the microphone. So yeah, any questions? VR, you can currently get ethical approval for VR, but how likely is that to remain the case?
I think all of these need to go through a very rigorous kind of ethical scrutiny. I mean, I think you have to be able to make your case on a case-by-case basis for why exposing people to these kinds of environments has the kind of public benefit, doesn't cause long-term damage for folks. I mean, and I genuinely think in our studies we can make that. But I mean, I agree there needs to be, because the technology is advancing so rapidly and it's becoming more and more available for use, that people are tempted to just use it as another tool without thinking through the longer term implications of this kind of stuff from an ethical perspective.
Is the group size, the larger the group, does that increase or decrease the number of escalating or de-escalating actions as a ratio?
Yes, you're exactly right. At least in our data, larger groups proportionally produce more de-escalation than escalation. So there seems to be something amplificatory about the group size. I mean, I wouldn't want to be heard making the claim that that's what always happens in groups. But I think there's something quite interesting about this, because my impression is most of the time, most groups, people want these things to be resolved peacefully. Violence is troublesome. It means that, you know, if people are going to fight, it's going to ruin the evening out. You might end up in a hospital, or the police might come.
There are groups that say fight.
No, and that's completely true. But I think those are the minority, and I think we tend to think that groups who want to fight define everybody. And I think that's been the problem, because actually it's a very small minority. And if in working with the police, often one of the messages is not to assume that all the groups they see are the same, and that they need to be careful, because what they want to do is not make all those people feel that the police think they're equally a threat. Because when people don't feel they're a threat, they're likely to be much more helpful to you. So it's just having that sense of nuance about this and not assuming. And we've done lots of interview studies, for example, where we've talked to people on a night out, and sometimes you come across people who are really quite scary, and they will say things like, actually when I go out, I don't tend to drink because I quite like it when I come across a big lad who's had lots and lots of beer, because I know I can really beat him up. So they are there for the violence. But those are a tiny, tiny minority. Most of the time when these things kick off, the people who are around them want it to stop in some way. They're not necessarily there to encourage it to happen.
So was there any differentiation between cultural identities and geographies?
So I can't answer that from our data, because our data is just from the north of England. But I am involved in a cross-national project now with some folks, and we've got some data from the UK, from the Netherlands, and from South Africa. So again, it allows us, South Africa, much more dangerous, has one of the highest murder rates in the country. You might expect there to be differences in degrees of intervention, and we're analysing the data now. But maybe I can ask you to vote on this. So we've got lots and lots of clips from these different places, about 60 clips in each. And all we've been doing to start off with is counting up, when a violent incident happens, how likely any one person is to intervene. Would anyone care to guess what the kind of baseline intervention rate for a person intervening in a violent incident is? 30%, 30%, any advance on 30%?
What do you define as intervening?
Any action which looks like it's trying to stop, so a calming down gesture, a de-escalation gesture of any sort. A good hypothesis. So far, our data tells us that the basic intervention rate in these kinds of incidents is 90%. So in 9 out of 10 instances, somebody does something to try and intervene. Okay, so what we think, therefore, is that this is not, when we're talking about bystander behaviour, we're not talking about the problem of getting people to intervene, because people are doing it. The more interesting question is, why is it sometimes successful and why does it sometimes fail? Okay, and then to answer to your other question, are there cross-national differences? Well, and again, in our data, no. So it's as high in the South African data as it is in the Netherlands data and the English data. So again, I think we're beginning to try and make quite a strong case for saying that actually there is a kind of general tendency amongst most people to want this kind of stuff to be stopped. And it's not trying to get them to want to do it, they want to do it, it's facilitating and making sure that whatever they do is successful.
How do you think the conclusions from your research can apply to different types of groups and different types of identities?
I mean, you make a good point, and we actually have started to look, for example, at whether we can tell from the footage we've got whether some of these are intra-group versus intergroup. So do folks know each other versus is it some kind of West Side Story kind of thing? And that we can do it, at least we think we can do it in terms of the judgments that our raters make. And the folks in Denmark who've got the police files, they've done this really interesting thing where they have got raters to go through and look at the videos and tell them whether they think this is inter or intra. And then they've gone back to the case files to confirm, and the raters kind of match up with the case files pretty well. So people can tell from the behaviour. So we can begin to start to unpick those sorts of things reasonably well. And you're right, it does make a difference. So the de-escalatory, the relative proportions of de-escalatory stuff within and between are different. So you're much more likely to do the kind of de-escalatory things inside than you are across. But what we started to do is to complicate that a bit more, which is to look at intra-group interactions in intergroup conflicts. So what happens when it's between? Yeah. So do you hold your guy back in an intergroup one, or do you kind of rush in behind him? Is this a leave no mates behind, or How do you manage that kind of stuff? So, what you're pointing to is exactly right. It is a more nuanced and complicated story, and we need more data, obviously, but we're beginning to try and unpick this a bit. I do think it differs. So, as a social identity theorist, I'd tell you that the kind of contents, the norms and the values of different identities would shape behaviours in importantly different ways. But I'm still also tempted to try and persuade you with the idea that there is actually something kind of more fundamental about kind of an anxiety over violence. I think it's quite hard to be violent. We often think it's easy, but there's lots and lots of research which says you actually have to do a lot of work to get people to do the violence in the first place. All these, particularly at the kind of critical times, because of course that's once you've put the cameras in, you've stumped up the money in advance, the major expense is having the people to do it, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for councils, because they are mostly run by councils, to find the money to have people there all the time. So they tend not to have them there all the time, but they will have them there at critical junctures, and they do then pan around, and their task is often there's quite a lot of interesting ethnographic work in these control rooms, looking at how operators make judgments about who to follow and who to pan and all that kind of stuff, which is quite interesting. But they are doing this kind of stuff, and they're waiting to make a decision about whether to call. But often they will get a call from a police officer or someone else saying, "Follow this." Yes, and sometimes irritatingly for us, they'd be following something which was really interesting. Then they'd get a call, and of course the cameras would then go over here, and then we would lose it.
Is the group size effect just relevant to humans or to primates as well?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to it. I don't think they've ever looked at group size in that way, but I can't be absolutely certain. I mean, yeah, I might go and look at that. That's very good. Thank you.
I have a question. So you were saying that you were looking at, when you were coding the CCTV footage, looking at the effect of gender. And we saw a couple of women who were kind of comforting one another when there was that violent act happening in the first CCTV clip. And I just wondered, were there any conclusions around the effect of gender on bystander behaviour?
In the new data sets that we're combining together with these other folk, we've now got enough. In the study that I told you about here, we were interested in gender, we just didn't have enough women. So contrary to the kind of anxiety about ladette culture and kind of women doing all these kind of dangerous things, there just weren't enough women either being perpetrators or bystanders to be able to tell a convincing story. What I can say in our data is that proportionally, even though there was much smaller numbers, women were contributing as much violence and as much de-escalation as the men, just smaller numbers. I think, though, that what we are now trying to tap into is that strategically men and women are able to do quite different things. So the actual content of the behaviour. So women can touch in a way that men can't. So men can't touch women. Women can touch men in this kind of conciliatory, calm, kind of down stuff. And so women would often kind of sneak in and grab the guy and kind of really rub him and all that kind of stuff. Men could never do that kind of stuff. But equally, women could get away with grievous acts that men would never be able to. So we had a woman take a kind of stiletto off, and she was whacking this guy on the head with a sharp end, and he wasn't really, he was just stunned and didn't kind of get the response. So I think there are important gendered stories to be told. We don't have enough data to tell the baseline kind of stuff, but I suspect there are, in terms of being interested in what works strategically, both for de-escalation as well as for escalation, there'll be different routes that men and women are able to kind of make use of to bring things under control, as well as to escalate them.
It's just a question about the response to the interviews on the night out.
So what we did was we gathered people to take part in a study on what makes for a good night out. Okay, so we didn't want to talk about violence because we didn't want them to be primed thinking that that's what we were interested in. But of course, these kind of war stories came about as people were telling us about stuff. And you've got some very interesting accounts of the kind of sort of group self-policing that I think you can see. So often people would say things like, I've got a mate, he always comes out with us, but after he's had a few drinks, he quite likes a bit of a Barney. And so they would say things like, so we have to babysit him. We have to make sure, he doesn't have too much pop, and we kind of keep an eye on him. And then they have strategies for kind of managing him, which sometimes, interestingly, include include letting him get beaten up. So they will say things like, sometimes he pushes it a bit too far, and then we let him get a bit of a kicking, right? Not brain damage, mind, but just so that he knows not to do it next time. So it's quite an interesting kind of landscape of this, and they're all sensitive to this. And I suspect all of us who've gone out in a group are familiar with the idea of kind of looking after the people in the group, particularly around things like someone might have had too much to drink, or making sure that that person gets home. So there's quite a strong sense that groups need to take responsibility for their members, and that often includes trying to manage the people in them who might be interested in violence. But at the same time, of course, we did get these kind of chilling groups where these guys would say, "Yo, actually, what makes a really good night out is whacking somebody," and then we go out to see if we can do that too. So it's not all hearts and flowers.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, cool. Well, Mark, thank you so much again.
Thank you for inviting me.
And yeah, thank you.